And the winner of the 2026 Young CEO of the Year award is Natalia Jordan, the host announced. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause as Natalia rose to her feet. Over the past year, she had proven herself to be one of the brightest and most promising leaders in the fashion industry. As she stood on stage, smiling, bowing graciously, and thanking everyone for their support, her husband was quietly linking his little finger beneath the table with the woman he was secretly having an affair with, Chaya, Natalia's own executive assistant. Both of them believed they had hidden their secrets so well that Natalia would never find out. Natalia stepped down from the stage with the crystal trophy in one hand and the bouquet of white lilies in the other. The applause hadn't completely faded before a crowd of guests gathered around her. Investors, designers, suppliers, and longtime business partners all wanted to congratulate the woman who had just been named the 2026 Young CEO of the Year. Her husband, Terry, reached her first. He embraced her with a smile while cameras continued capturing the celebration from every angle. To everyone in the ballroom, the moment felt completely natural. Over the years, people had grown used to seeing him standing beside Natalia at every major milestone in her career. A few seconds later, Chaya stepped forward and took the bouquet from Natalia so she could shake hands with several guests waiting nearby. She also held the trophy for a moment while Natalia greeted a group of investors who had traveled from New York for the ceremony. Natalia never hesitated before handing over either one. Trust had turned those small gestures into habit. During the past 5 years, her assistant had become the person responsible for nearly every detail surrounding Natalia's work. Flight schedules, meetings, contracts, fashion shows, interviews, charity events, and international travel all passed through her before reaching Natalia. Even on evenings like this, she always seemed to know exactly what Natalia needed before Natalia asked for it. When another photographer invited them to the sponsor backdrop, Natalia took the trophy back, thanked her assistant with a smile, and walked toward the cameras. Terry stood on one side. Her assistant stood on the other. They spent the next several minutes posing for individual photographs, company photographs, and group photographs with sponsors and guests. Looking at them together, it was difficult to imagine 3 people who trusted one another more. That belief wasn't created for the cameras. It had been built over years of working, celebrating, and overcoming challenges together. Before the celebration dinner had even begun, photographs from the award ceremony were already spreading across business news websites. By midnight, fashion magazines had published articles praising Natalia's achievement, while dozens of social media pages shared the same photographs taken only an hour earlier. One image appeared more often than the others. Natalia stood beside her husband, holding the crystal trophy with a confident smile. The picture quickly became the favorite of reporters writing about successful entrepreneurs. Many of them described the couple as an example of a modern marriage built on mutual respect rather than competition. Readers filled the comment sections with admiration. Some praised Natalia for building one of the country's fastest-growing fashion brands before turning 35. Others admired Terry for remaining supportive instead of feeling overshadowed by her success. More than a few people commented that genuine partnerships like theirs had become increasingly rare. Several business magazines also mentioned the woman standing beside them in the group photographs. Although her name rarely appeared in the headlines, she was described as the executive assistant who had helped manage Natalia's demanding schedule for years. Inside the company, employees already knew that description wasn't an exaggeration. If Natalia was the face of the business, her assistant had quietly become the person who kept countless parts of it moving every single day. By the following morning, the award ceremony had become one of the biggest business stories in the fashion industry. Everywhere people looked, they saw the same image. A successful entrepreneur, a supportive husband, and a trusted assistant sharing the happiest night of Natalia's career. By the following morning, photographs from the award ceremony had spread across business magazines, fashion websites, and social media. The image that appeared most often showed Natalia standing beside Terry with the crystal trophy in her hands. Within hours, thousands of people had shared it, calling them one of the most inspiring couples in the business world. Reporters praised Natalia for building a successful fashion company before the age of 35, but many articles devoted just as much attention to the man standing beside her. They described him as the husband who had never been intimidated by his wife's success. Readers admired the balance they seemed to have created between ambition and marriage. Comments poured in beneath every article. Some women hoped to find a partner as supportive as Natalia's husband. Some men said every successful marriage should look exactly like theirs. A television interview recorded months earlier quickly began circulating again. During that interview, Natalia had explained that building a company was never the work of one person. She credited her employees, her business partners, and especially her husband for standing beside her through every difficult stage of the journey. Those words made the interview even more popular after the awards ceremony. Every headline, every photograph, and every interview strengthened the same image in people's minds. Natalia wasn't only seen as a successful entrepreneur. She represented the dream of having both a thriving career and a happy marriage at the same time. While reporters focused on Natalia and Terry, another person continued moving quietly from one responsibility to the next. Chaya spent the entire morning replying to interview requests, confirming television appearances, rearranging meetings, and answering dozens of phone calls from clients and business partners. She knew exactly which interviews Natalia preferred, which investors deserved priority, and which appointments could be postponed without creating problems. Inside the company, almost everyone relied on her. Department managers contacted her before requesting time with Natalia. Suppliers checked with her before scheduling factory visits. Even longtime business partners often called her first because they knew she could reach Natalia faster than anyone else. Employees respected her efficiency, and Natalia trusted her judgment enough to let her manage nearly every detail surrounding her professional life. It had reached the point where Natalia rarely checked her own calendar anymore. If her assistant said a meeting had been arranged, Natalia simply showed up. If a flight had been booked, she packed her suitcase without asking another question. Years of working side by side had turned trust into routine. From the outside, it looked like the perfect partnership between a successful executive and the employee who helped keep everything organized. No one inside the company questioned it because nothing about their daily routine gave anyone a reason to. Winning the Young CEO of the Year award brought Natalia even more attention, but very little changed inside the company. She still arrived at the office before most employees and usually walked through every department before entering her own office. Instead of heading straight to executive meetings, she often stopped at the design studio to review new sketches, visited the fabric samples waiting on the conference table, or spent a few minutes talking with store managers about customer feedback from the previous week. She believed numbers explained what had already happened, while customers explained what would happen next. That habit had remained unchanged since the company was still operating from a small warehouse years earlier. Employees appreciated the fact that success had never created distance between Natalia and the people working for her. Designers could still bring unfinished ideas directly to her desk. Store managers could still call her whenever a customer raised an unusual request. Factory supervisors knew she would visit the production floor without announcing it in advance because she preferred seeing daily operations exactly as they were instead of preparing for her arrival. Inside the company, people respected Natalia because they believed she understood every part of the business she had built. That respect couldn't be created by awards or headlines. It had been earned through years of working alongside them. When work ended each evening, Natalia left the office carrying far less pressure than most people expected from someone responsible for hundreds of employees. She knew the company was surrounded by capable people who understood their responsibilities without waiting for constant instructions. Terry often arrived a few minutes before she finished for the day, and they drove home together whenever their schedules allowed. During busy weeks, her assistant remained at the office a little longer to prepare the following day's meetings, making sure every document, contract, and presentation would already be waiting before Natalia arrived the next morning. It had become a rhythm that rarely changed. Everyone knew what needed to be done, and everyone seemed committed to the same goal. Looking from the outside, there was very little missing from Natalia's life. She had built a respected company, earned recognition across the industry, married someone the public admired, and surrounded herself with people she believed she could depend on. If anyone had asked her whether she was satisfied with the life she had built, the answer would have been simple. She believed she was exactly where years of hard work had brought her. People often assumed trust was built through grand gestures, but Natalia knew it usually grew from ordinary routines repeated over many years. Terry had access to the house, their finances, and almost every important part of her personal life. Chaya had access to her calendar, business travel, confidential documents, and the daily operation of the company. Those responsibilities had never been handed over all at once. They had accumulated little by little until trusting them became as natural as breathing. If a meeting changed at the last minute, Natalia assumed her assistant had a good reason. If Terry said he would meet a client for dinner or stay out later than expected, she never saw a reason to ask unnecessary questions. Neither of them had ever given her a reason to doubt them. Looking back, there had been countless opportunities to become suspicious, but suspicion had never matched the life she believed she was living. She trusted because trust had always worked. It was the foundation of her marriage, her company, and almost every important relationship she had built over the past decade. 3 days after the award ceremony, Natalia walked into the company's headquarters carrying the same energy she brought to work every morning. Employees congratulated her again as she crossed the lobby, though most of them had already seen the trophy and the photographs over the weekend. Someone had placed fresh flowers beside the display case holding the Young CEO Award, and several younger employees stopped to admire it before heading upstairs. Natalia thanked everyone with the same easy smile before taking the elevator to the executive floor. Her assistant was already waiting outside the office with the day's schedule prepared in a leather folder. The morning included a design review, a meeting with fabric suppliers, lunch with potential retail partners, and an afternoon strategy session for the company's next collection. Natalia accepted the folder without reading it immediately. She never felt the need to double-check every detail because she trusted the person who had arranged it. After placing the trophy inside the display cabinet behind her desk, she opened the first file of the day and asked her assistant to send in the design team. Outside the office, another work week had begun exactly as every employee expected. No one realized that beneath the familiar routine, a different story had already started moving in a direction none of them could see. Long before magazines called Natalia one of the country's most successful young entrepreneurs, almost no one in the fashion industry knew her name. She wasn't born into a family that owned clothing factories or luxury brands. She had no investors waiting to fund her first idea and no shortcuts waiting after graduation. During college, she attended classes during the day and worked part-time whenever she could. Some evenings ended in a fabric warehouse where she learned how different materials were stored and graded. Other weekends were spent inside small garment workshops watching experienced pattern makers solve problems that never appeared in textbooks. While many classmates focused on passing exams, Natalia wanted to understand how a piece of clothing came to life long before it reached a customer. She paid attention to everything, from fabric quality and dye consistency to production costs and shipping schedules. Every job taught her a different part of the business, and every paycheck became another small step toward the future she wanted to build. After graduating, Natalia didn't try to start a fashion brand right away. She believed running a company without understanding how the industry actually worked would only create expensive mistakes. Instead, she accepted a position at a textile distributor. The salary wasn't impressive, but the experience was worth far more than the paycheck. Every day she met factory owners, fabric mills, clothing manufacturers, and purchasing managers from brands of every size. She learned how prices changed with the seasons, why the same fabric could perform differently from one supplier to another, and how a single delay at the mill could affect an entire production schedule weeks later. Whenever work ended, she filled notebooks with everything she had learned that day. Most of her coworkers left the office thinking about the weekend. Natalia went home thinking about fabrics, supply chains, and how one decision could influence every step that followed. She wasn't trying to become the best employee. She was quietly preparing herself to become the person making those decisions one day. After nearly 3 years in the textile business, Natalia knew fabrics better than many designers and understood suppliers better than many purchasing managers. She also realized something that changed the direction of her career. Every clothing brand depended on the same supply chain, yet the companies that truly stood out weren't selling fabric. They were selling identity. Customers rarely remembered where a fabric came from, but they remembered how a jacket fit, how a blazer made them feel during an important meeting, and whether they trusted a brand enough to return for another purchase. That realization stayed with Natalia for months. She continued working as usual, but she spent every evening studying successful fashion companies instead of textile suppliers. She compared their products, their pricing, their marketing, and the way they built long-term relationships with customers. The more she learned, the clearer her next goal became. She no longer wanted to supply materials for someone else's brand. She wanted to build one of her own. Natalia didn't resign the moment she made that decision. She waited until she believed she had learned everything her position could teach her. By then, she had built relationships with reliable fabric mills, manufacturers, logistics, partners, and quality inspectors across several states. Those connections would later become one of her biggest advantages. Instead of opening a fashion store immediately, she started with something much smaller. She supplied carefully selected fabrics to independent clothing businesses that couldn't meet the minimum order requirements demanded by larger distributors. The business began from a modest warehouse with only a handful of clients, but Natalia earned a reputation for something competitors often ignored. If she believed a fabric wasn't suitable for a customer's product, she said so, even when it meant losing a sale. Some buyers walked away. Many more came back. Little by little, trust became the strongest product her company offered. For the next several years, Natalia focused on growing the textile business instead of chasing rapid expansion. She traveled constantly, visiting mills, inspecting production lines, and meeting factory owners in person. Whenever a shipment arrived, she preferred checking random rolls herself rather than relying entirely on inspection reports. More than once, she rejected entire orders after finding defects that others considered acceptable. Some suppliers complained that she was too demanding. Others eventually admitted that working with Natalia forced them to improve their own standards. Customers noticed the difference. They knew that if a shipment carried her company's name, the materials had already passed someone who refused to lower expectations simply to increase profits. Orders became larger, referrals became more frequent, and the business continued growing without expensive advertising. Natalia believed reputation traveled farther than marketing ever could, and she invested far more effort protecting one than paying for the other. As the company became one of the region's most reliable fabric distributors, Natalia found herself thinking less about textiles and more about the women who would eventually wear the finished clothing. She had spent years listening to designers complain about inconsistent materials, retailers complain about delayed production, and customers complain that professional clothing either looked fashionable or felt comfortable, but rarely both. The complaints came from different people, yet many pointed toward the same problem. Natalia filled notebook after notebook with observations collected during factory visits, trade shows, and conversations with store owners. Patterns slowly began to appear. She wasn't searching for the next fashion trend. She was searching for problems that no one had solved well enough. By the time she closed the final notebook, the decision had already been made. The textile business had given her experience, relationships, and financial stability. It had also prepared her for the next chapter. Natalia was ready to build a fashion brand that carried her own name and her own standards. Natalia never dreamed of opening dozens of stores on her first day. She rented a modest workshop, hired a small team of experienced pattern makers and seamstresses, and focused on one category she understood better than anything else: women's office wear. She believed professional clothing shouldn't force women to choose between looking confident and feeling comfortable. Every blazer, pair of trousers, and dress had to achieve both. Instead of releasing a large collection, she introduced only a handful of carefully refined designs. Each piece went through multiple revisions before reaching customers. If the fit wasn't right, production stopped. If the fabric didn't perform as expected after repeated washing, the design returned to development. Those decisions slowed the business during its first year, but they also established standards that would remain unchanged as the company grew. Natalia spent as much time inside her stores as she did inside her office. She watched how customers moved through the displays, which designs they picked up first, and which ones they returned to the rack after trying them on. Whenever someone agreed to share an opinion, she listened more than she spoke. Some women wanted jackets that looked professional without feeling stiff. Others struggled to find work clothes that remained comfortable during long days at the office. A few pointed out small details that most designers rarely considered, including pocket placement, sleeve length, and fabrics that wrinkled too easily after sitting through meetings. Natalia wrote everything down. Every comment became another piece of information that shaped future collections. While some competitors relied on trend forecasts, Natalia relied on conversations with the people who actually wore the clothing. Little by little, customers noticed that the brand seemed to understand their daily lives better than many larger companies. They returned not because every collection followed the latest fashion trend, but because the clothes solved problems they faced every morning before leaving for work. Natalia refused to expand simply because sales were increasing. Before opening a second store, she spent months reviewing customer feedback, inventory reports, return rates, and operating costs. She believed a growing business only became stronger when every new location could deliver the same experience as the first. Once she felt confident the system could be repeated, the second store opened. Then came a third. Each new location followed the same standards, from store layout and lighting to customer service and product presentation. Managers received training directly from Natalia, not only on how to sell clothing, but on how to understand the people buying it. She reminded them that every customer walking through the door had a reason for shopping. Some were preparing for their first interview. Others had just received a promotion. Some were rebuilding their confidence after returning to work. Selling a blazer was easy. Helping someone feel ready for an important moment in life was what truly mattered. That philosophy gradually became part of the company's culture, and customers noticed the difference every time they visited one of her stores. 5 years after opening her first workshop, Natalia's company had grown far beyond what she had imagined during those early days, surrounded by fabric rolls and sewing machines. Her brand had expanded into multiple cities, while the textile business that started everything continued supporting the growing operation behind the scenes. Industry magazines began mentioning her company alongside brands that had existed for decades. Competitors paid attention whenever a new collection was released because they knew customers would compare everything against Natalia's designs. Despite the recognition, her daily routine changed very little. She still reviewed new fabrics before approving production. She still walked through stores without announcing her arrival. She still believed one unhappy customer deserved as much attention as 100 satisfied ones. Awards, headlines, and growing revenue became milestones rather than destinations. Natalia measured success differently. As long as customers continued returning because they trusted the brand, she believed the company was moving in the right direction. That belief became the foundation on which every future decision would be made. Natalia met her future husband long before newspapers recognized her name. At the time, her textile business was still small, and every dollar she earned went back into inventory, warehouse space, or expanding her supplier network. He worked as a sales manager for a regional logistics company and first crossed paths with Natalia during a meeting about shipping costs. Their conversation remained entirely professional, but unlike many people she met through business, he never seemed interested in how much money she made or how quickly her company was growing. He listened more than he spoke, treated every meeting with respect, and never tried to impress her by pretending to know more than he actually did. As their paths crossed more often, business conversations gradually turned into dinners after work and weekend coffee meetings. Natalia appreciated how comfortable everything felt. She spent every day making difficult decisions, negotiating contracts, and solving problems. Being around him never felt like another responsibility waiting to be handled. It felt simple. And after years of putting work ahead of everything else, simplicity was something she had almost forgotten. Their relationship developed slowly. Natalia had invested too much time building her career to rush into anything that might distract her from it. She paid attention to consistency more than romantic gestures, and over time she noticed the same pattern again and again. Whenever work forced her to cancel dinner, he accepted it without complaint. When business trips kept her away for days, he never questioned her priorities or asked her to choose between work and the relationship. Instead of competing with her ambitions, he seemed willing to build his own life alongside them. Friends often joked that finding a man comfortable dating a woman more successful than himself was almost impossible. Natalia never saw it that way. She believed confidence wasn't measured by income or job titles. It was measured by how secure someone remained when another person's success continued growing. The longer they stayed together, the more she believed she had found someone who understood that better than anyone she had met before. By the time Natalia accepted his proposal, her business had already begun expanding beyond its first location. Friends questioned whether marriage was the right decision while her company demanded more of her time than ever before. Natalia understood their concerns, but she also believed a successful relationship depended less on perfect timing than on choosing the right person. Before the wedding, she made one thing clear. Building the company would continue to be a major part of her life, and there would be seasons when work came before everything else. He didn't argue. He didn't ask her to slow down or promise to change after they were married. He accepted the future exactly as Natalia described it. That honesty gave her confidence. She wasn't marrying someone who expected her to become a different person. She believed she was marrying someone who respected the person she had already become. Marriage didn't change the balance between their careers. As Natalia's company continued growing, her public profile rose with it. Interviews, conferences, fashion events, and business awards gradually became part of her routine. Wherever they went, people recognized Natalia first. Reporters asked for her opinion. Investors wanted to meet her. Customers lined up to take photographs with her. Terry stood beside her through all of it, offering congratulations whenever another milestone arrived. At least, that was what everyone saw. What they didn't see were the quiet moments that never reached the cameras. Introductions where people forgot his name only seconds after hearing it. Business dinners where every conversation returned to Natalia's achievements. Social events where guests thanked him for supporting such a remarkable woman before turning their attention back to her. None of those moments were dramatic enough to become arguments, but they accumulated over the years. Natalia never noticed because she wasn't trying to stand above him. She was simply moving forward, one goal after another. He smiled through every celebration, yet somewhere inside him, the distance between being Natalia's husband and being his own person became a little harder to ignore. As Natalia's company expanded, managing every detail alone became impossible. New stores were opening, investor meetings filled her calendar, and business trips became more frequent with each passing season. She needed someone who could organize her schedule, protect confidential information, and keep the growing company running smoothly while she focused on leading it. Among dozens of applicants was Chaya, a calm, organized young woman applying for the position of executive assistant. During the interview, Chaya never tried to impress Natalia with exaggerated promises. Instead, she answered every question directly, admitted what she didn't know, and explained how she planned to learn quickly. That honesty stood out more than any polished resume. Natalia offered Chaya the position before the interview process was even complete. Over the following months, Chaya proved that the decision had been the right one. She remembered every appointment without reminders, anticipated scheduling conflicts before they happened, and handled confidential documents with remarkable care. As the company continued growing, Chaya gradually became one of the few people Natalia relied on every single day. Clients respected her professionalism, employees appreciated her efficiency, and Terry often thanked her for making Natalia's overwhelming schedule easier to manage. Before long, trusting Chaya no longer felt like a business decision. It simply became part of Natalia's daily life. Because of her responsibilities, the assistant naturally spent more time around both Natalia and Terry than almost anyone else. She coordinated charity events they attended together, booked flights for business trips, arranged hotel reservations, and often remained nearby whenever schedules changed unexpectedly. At first, their conversations rarely moved beyond work. They discussed travel plans, event timings, and small details that kept Natalia's increasingly busy calendar running smoothly. Months passed, then years. Familiar faces became familiar conversations. Familiar conversations became comfortable routines. Sometimes Natalia stayed behind after meetings to speak with investors while Terry and the assistant waited in the lobby. Sometimes they found themselves sitting at the same table during company dinners while Natalia was occupied greeting clients or giving interviews. None of those moments seemed unusual. In a growing company where people worked closely together every day, they were simply part of the routine. Neither Natalia nor anyone else saw a reason to think twice about it. After all, they were two people she trusted more than almost anyone in her life. The change didn't happen overnight. It arrived so gradually that neither of them could have pointed to the exact day it began. Natalia's company continued expanding into new markets, and her schedule became more demanding than ever. There were weeks when she flew to 2 or 3 cities before returning home. Product launches, investor meetings, factory inspections, and fashion events left very little room for anything else. Terry gradually spent more time speaking with the assistant simply because she always knew where Natalia was, when she would be available, or whether another meeting had been added to the calendar. What began as practical conversations slowly became casual ones. They joked about delayed flights, impossible schedules, and how difficult it had become to find a free evening on Natalia's calendar. Sometimes they shared lunch while waiting for a meeting to finish. Sometimes they sat together at company events after Natalia had been called away by reporters or business partners. None of it looked unusual. Anyone watching would have assumed they were simply discussing work. That explanation was true often enough that neither of them questioned it. The assistant had watched Natalia's life from closer than almost anyone else. She saw the custom suits delivered to the office, the luxury hotels booked for business trips, the interviews, the awards, and the respect Natalia received wherever she went. She also saw the home waiting at the end of each day, the husband standing beside her at public events, and the life many people admired from a distance. At first, those things inspired her. She wanted to become successful enough to build a life of her own. Over time, admiration slowly turned into comparison. Comparison became dissatisfaction. She began asking herself why two women working under the same roof could end up living such different lives. Natalia had built everything through years of discipline and sacrifice, but the assistant no longer focused on that part of the story. Her attention settled on the result instead of the journey. Little by little, gratitude gave way to envy. She never spoke about those thoughts to anyone. They remained hidden behind the same professional smile she wore every day at work. The first time the assistant realized she was developing feelings for Natalia's husband, she convinced herself it was nothing more than a passing emotion. She stopped replying to personal messages that had nothing to do with work. She avoided sitting beside him during company dinners whenever another seat was available. For several weeks, she tried creating distance between them without drawing attention to it. The effort didn't last. Every working day brought them back into the same meetings, the same events, and the same conversations. Natalia trusted both of them so completely that she often asked them to handle things together while she focused on investors or clients. Neither of them had planned for the boundaries to disappear. They simply stopped noticing where those boundaries had once been. One conversation became two. A quick coffee before a meeting became a habit. Personal stories slowly replaced business topics. By the time either of them recognized what was happening, walking away no longer felt as easy as it should have. Neither of them wanted to become the reason Natalia's life fell apart. At least that was what they told themselves in the beginning. They never met in places where someone from the company might recognize them. They avoided phone calls that could appear in unexpected moments. Most of their conversations happened during business trips, company events, or schedule changes that already required them to spend time in the same place. They convinced themselves that as long as no one was hurt, they still had time to end everything before it became irreversible. Each decision felt small enough to justify on its own. Together, those decisions slowly created a secret that neither of them had expected to carry. Every day they promised themselves it would go no further. Every day they found another reason to postpone that promise until tomorrow. Meanwhile, Natalia continued living exactly as she always had, believing the two people she trusted most were simply doing everything they could to support both her life and the company she had spent years building. Monday came and went like every other week. Natalia buried herself in meetings, approved new fabric samples, reviewed store performance, and discussed plans for the company's next collection. The Young CEO Award remained on display inside her office, but she rarely looked at it. For Natalia, recognition was never the finish line. Every achievement simply marked the beginning of another responsibility. Terry continued following his own routine, leaving for work each morning and returning home in the evening. Chaya managed Natalia's calendar with the same efficiency she always had, keeping meetings on schedule and solving problems before they reached the executive office. Employees quickly stopped talking about the award and returned to deadlines, production targets, and the upcoming autumn collection. Within only a few days, life inside the company looked almost identical to the way it had before the ceremony. From Natalia's point of view, nothing important had changed. The applause, the headlines, and the interviews had already faded into the background. What remained was the ordinary rhythm of a business that never stopped moving forward. The first changes were too ordinary to attract attention. Terry began mentioning work dinners more often than before. Some evenings he returned home after Natalia had already fallen asleep. Other nights, he explained that a client wanted to continue talking after dinner or that traffic had delayed everyone. Natalia accepted every explanation without giving it another thought. Her own schedule was just as demanding. There were days when she barely looked at her phone until late evening. Missing dinner together had become common long before any of those late nights began. At the office, her assistant occasionally adjusted meetings at the last minute or rearranged travel plans because of unexpected requests from clients. Those situations happened often in a growing company, and Natalia appreciated having someone who could solve problems before they reached her desk. Looking at each event separately, nothing seemed unusual. They were the kinds of small interruptions that naturally came with busy careers. Over the years, Natalia had developed a habit that made both her business and her personal life run smoothly. Whenever something unexpected happened, she looked for a reasonable explanation instead of assuming the worst. That mindset had helped her solve countless business problems, and it shaped the way she viewed the people closest to her. When Terry called to say a client wanted to continue dinner a little longer, she believed him. Sales often happened after office hours, and she understood that better than most people. On evenings when she arrived home first, she usually ate dinner while reviewing fabric samples or preparing for the next day's meetings. By the time Terry returned, she was often still working at the dining table with reports spread around her. Some nights they talked for half an hour before going to bed. Other nights they were both too exhausted for more than a few quiet conversations. Inside the company, Chaya occasionally stepped into the office to explain that a meeting had been rescheduled, a supplier had changed delivery times, or a travel plan needed to be adjusted because something unexpected had happened. Natalia almost never asked for additional details. Years of watching Chaya solve problems efficiently had taught her that every decision had already been carefully considered before it reached her desk. That trust allowed Natalia to spend her energy growing the company instead of checking every decision made by the people around her. She never realized that the same habit which had helped build a successful business also made it easier for the people she trusted most to hide the truth. The affair never depended on dramatic lies. It survived because it blended naturally into routines that already existed. Terry had legitimate reasons to contact Chaya almost every day. Sometimes he needed to know whether Natalia would finish a meeting on time. Other times he asked if her flight had landed safely or whether another client had changed the evening schedule. Those conversations sounded exactly like the kind of communication people expected between a husband and the executive assistant managing his wife's calendar. Over time, work messages slowly became personal conversations. A quick question was followed by a casual remark. A casual remark turned into longer exchanges that had nothing to do with Natalia's schedule. Whenever Natalia traveled, Chaya coordinated flights, hotels, transportation, and last-minute changes. Terry occasionally offered to help whenever something unexpected happened, giving them even more reasons to stay in touch. From the outside, everything appeared perfectly reasonable. Inside the office, they behaved no differently than before. They never argued, flirted, or acted carelessly in front of anyone. The more ordinary their interactions looked, the more confident they became that no one would ever question them. Without realizing it, they had built a secret that survived, not because it was hidden well, but because it looked exactly like everyday life. As the years passed, people inside the company began seeing Terry and Chaya as two of the most dependable people around Natalia. Terry frequently attended charity events, fashion shows, and industry gatherings with her, while Chaya handled the endless stream of meetings, travel arrangements, and executive decisions waiting behind the scenes. Employees often joked that Natalia could probably run 3 companies at once because she had such reliable people supporting her. Clients appreciated how smoothly every meeting was organized. Investors admired how efficiently the executive office operated. No one questioned why Terry and Chaya occasionally spoke before events or exchanged quick updates throughout the day. From everyone else's perspective, they were simply making Natalia's demanding schedule easier to manage. The trust surrounding them became so complete that even the smallest interactions escaped notice. By then, neither Terry nor Chaya worried very much about attracting suspicion. They had spent years earning everyone's confidence, and that confidence had become the safest place to hide. Nearly 2 months after the award ceremony, Natalia returned to the office earlier than expected after a meeting with a fabric supplier ended ahead of schedule. She walked through the executive floor reviewing notes on the next collection while employees greeted her as she passed. Nothing seemed unusual. Her assistant was speaking with the design department about sample deliveries. Terry had sent a message saying he would have dinner with an important client that evening. Everything matched the schedule she had been given that morning. As Natalia entered her office, she reached for a document she wanted to review before the afternoon meeting. Her assistant stepped inside a moment later and placed another folder on the desk, explaining that one of the investors had requested a few additional changes before signing the agreement. It was another ordinary conversation, lasting no more than a minute. Yet after her assistant left the room, Natalia found herself staring at the closed office door for a few seconds. She couldn't explain why. Nothing had been said. Nothing had happened. The feeling disappeared almost as quickly as it came, and she returned to the documents waiting on her desk. By the end of the afternoon, she had already forgotten about it, treating it as nothing more than another passing distraction during a busy workday. Natalia had always believed trust made people more efficient. That belief shaped the way she managed both her company and her marriage. She didn't ask to see Terry's phone because she had never felt a reason to. She didn't review her assistant's emails before they were sent because she had hired her to make decisions, not wait for permission. Delegating responsibility had allowed the business to grow far beyond what one person could manage alone. It also gave the people around her room to earn even more responsibility over time. Looking back, it was difficult to remember exactly when those boundaries had disappeared. Her assistant had gradually gained access to confidential contracts, financial reports, investor schedules, and even the passwords needed to arrange executive travel. Terry knew where important documents were kept at home, handled household finances whenever Natalia was traveling, and occasionally signed for deliveries that arrived while she was away. None of those responsibilities had ever worried her. They reflected years of trust built through consistency. Natalia often believed that constantly checking people only proved one thing, that you had chosen the wrong people in the first place. She preferred choosing carefully, trusting completely, and focusing her energy on building the future instead of guarding against everyone around her. It was a philosophy that had helped her build an extraordinary company. She never imagined the same philosophy could one day be used against her. Late one Thursday afternoon, Natalia finished reviewing a new collection earlier than expected. As she gathered the sample sketches on her desk, she remembered promising Terry they would finally have dinner together after postponing it twice that month. She reached for her phone and sent him a short message, asking if he was still free that evening. Several minutes passed before a reply arrived. He apologized and explained that an important client had requested a last-minute dinner to discuss a potential partnership. Natalia smiled to herself before placing the phone back on her desk. She understood those situations better than most people. Business opportunities rarely waited for convenient schedules. Rather than feeling disappointed, she called home, asked the housekeeper not to prepare dinner for two, and decided to stay at the office a little longer to finish reviewing the next season's designs. Around the same time, her assistant stepped into the office carrying several documents that required Natalia's signature before the end of the day. They spent another hour discussing production timelines, supplier contracts, and preparations for an upcoming fashion exhibition. By the time Natalia finally left the building, the parking lot was almost empty. She drove home, believing the evening had unfolded exactly the way everyone had described it. She never considered that two separate explanations, each perfectly reasonable on its own, could be hiding the same destination. Looking back, Natalia often believed she had been incredibly fortunate. She had built a successful company from a small dream, shared that journey with Terry, and found someone as dependable as Chaya to help carry the growing weight of the business. There were difficult days, exhausting seasons, and moments when the pressure felt overwhelming, but she never questioned the people standing beside her. When unexpected problems appeared, Terry offered encouragement. When her schedule became impossible to manage, Chaya somehow found a solution. Together, they seemed to make every challenge easier to overcome. Natalia never imagined she needed to look any deeper than that. As long as the business continued growing and the people she loved remained close, she believed she already had everything that truly mattered. Without realizing it, Natalia had started accepting certain explanations before anyone finished giving them. If a meeting ran late, she expected her assistant to reorganize the rest of the day. If Terry called to cancel dinner, she assumed work had simply become busy again. Those expectations made life easier because they fit the rhythm everyone had lived for years. Gradually, that rhythm became predictable enough that no one needed to explain very much anymore. A short message saying, "I'll be late," was enough. A note on the calendar showing a schedule change required no further discussion. Everyone already knew what their responsibilities were. The less Natalia questioned those everyday changes, the more invisible they became. To her, they were signs of a busy but well-organized life. To someone watching from the outside, they were ordinary routines shared by thousands of successful professionals. Nothing stood out, nothing demanded attention. And because nothing appeared unusual on its own, Natalia never thought about connecting one ordinary day to the next. A month later, Natalia flew to Chicago for a 2-day meeting with a national retail chain that was considering carrying her brand in more than 100 stores. Opportunities like that couldn't be delegated, so she planned to spend the entire trip meeting buyers, reviewing contracts, and visiting several flagship locations. Before leaving, she went through the schedule one last time with Chaya. Every meeting, hotel reservation, flight, and transportation arrangement had already been confirmed. It was the same routine they followed before every business trip. Natalia thanked her for putting everything together, picked up her suitcase, and headed to the airport without checking another detail. She never felt the need to. For years, every trip had gone exactly as planned. While Natalia spent the next 2 days moving from one meeting room to another, life at home continued as usual. Terry went to work each morning. The executive assistant arrived at the office before everyone else. Employees focused on deadlines for the upcoming collection. Nothing about those 2 days appeared different from any other week. When Natalia called home in the evening, the conversations remained brief. She talked about negotiations, fabric displays, and how exhausted she felt after spending hours with buyers. Terry listened, encouraged her to get some rest, and reminded her not to skip dinner. The calls ended the same way they always had. Natalia went to sleep, believing everything back home was exactly where it should be. During those 2 days, the assistant found herself working even more closely with Natalia's husband than usual. Several documents required signatures before Natalia returned, and a charity event scheduled for the following weekend needed last-minute adjustments after one of the sponsors withdrew. They exchanged messages throughout the day, discussing schedules, confirming details, and solving problems that couldn't wait until Natalia came home. By evening, most of the work had already been finished. One of them suggested grabbing dinner before heading home. It seemed like the easiest way to review everything one final time without spending another hour exchanging messages later that night. They chose a small restaurant, several neighborhoods away from the company's headquarters, somewhere neither of them had ever visited with coworkers or clients. Dinner began with conversations about contracts, event planning, and Natalia's trip. Before they noticed, those topics slowly gave way to discussions about their own lives, their frustrations, and the things neither of them felt comfortable saying to anyone else. When they finally walked out of the restaurant, both understood that the evening had crossed a line they had spent months pretending didn't exist. Neither of them said it aloud. Neither of them needed to. Several weeks passed without a single incident that seemed worth remembering. Natalia remained focused on preparing the company's largest autumn collection while negotiations with the national retail chain entered their final stage. One afternoon, she finished a meeting earlier than expected and returned to her office before the next appointment. Her own phone had nearly run out of battery after a morning filled with calls, so she reached across the desk and picked up the company phone Chaya normally used whenever they traveled. Chaya had left it on Natalia's desk earlier that morning after connecting it to the conference room system for a presentation. Before Natalia could unlock the screen, a notification appeared across the top. She wasn't trying to read anyone's messages. The preview simply appeared before her eyes. The sender's name made her pause. It was Terry. The message itself was short. Dinner tomorrow? Same place as last time. Natalia stared at the screen for several seconds. Her first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. She assumed he must have sent it by mistake. Perhaps he wanted to ask whether she was free the following evening and had accidentally selected the wrong conversation. It sounded like the most reasonable explanation. Without opening the message, she placed the phone back on the desk. A few moments later, Chaya entered the office carrying several sample sketches for the next collection. Natalia said nothing about what she had seen. The meeting continued exactly as planned. They discussed fabrics, production schedules, and deadlines before moving on to the next appointment. Yet for the first time in years, a simple message refused to leave Natalia's thoughts. Natalia spent the rest of the afternoon convincing herself there had to be a simple explanation. Terry knew Chaya almost as well as he knew many of the senior managers in the company. They had worked around each other for years. Discussing schedules or meeting over dinner to prepare for an upcoming charity event wasn't impossible. In fact, given how closely they both supported her daily life, it almost sounded practical. Even so, one detail continued bothering her. Same place as last time. The words suggested the dinner wasn't a one-time meeting. It suggested there had been another one before it. Natalia opened her own calendar and looked back through the previous few weeks. She searched for charity events, business dinners, and meetings that might explain the message. The dates matched several occasions when she had been traveling or tied up with investors until late in the evening. She closed the calendar without reaching a conclusion. By the time she returned home that night, she had already decided she wouldn't mention the message. Asking a question based on a single notification felt unfair to two people she had trusted for years. If there was an innocent explanation, she didn't want to insult either of them by acting suspicious. Still, something had changed. For the first time in a very long time, Natalia realized she was thinking about two people she had always trusted without question. She wasn't ready to call it doubt. It was simply a question that had appeared without an answer, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the question remained. The following morning, Natalia arrived at the office, determined to forget the message she had seen the day before. She buried herself in meetings, approved several design revisions, and spent nearly an hour discussing fabric quality with one of her longtime suppliers. Whenever the thought returned, she pushed it aside with another reasonable explanation. By lunchtime, she almost convinced herself the matter was over. Then, as she walked past the reception area on her way back from a meeting, she overheard two junior employees talking about a newly opened Italian restaurant downtown. One of them mentioned how difficult it had become to reserve a table because the restaurant had become popular with business executives. Natalia slowed her steps without realizing it. She recognized the name immediately. It was the same restaurant Terry had once recommended after saying he had discovered it during a dinner with clients. She had never been there herself because every time they planned to go together, work forced one of them to cancel. The memory lingered longer than it should have. Back inside her office, Natalia opened the city's restaurant website almost absent-mindedly. The photographs matched the place Terry had described months earlier. She closed the page after only a few seconds. None of it proved anything. A popular restaurant attracted thousands of customers every week. The message could still have an innocent explanation. Yet for the first time, Natalia realized she wasn't trying to answer a question anymore. She was trying to convince herself to stop asking it. That evening, Natalia left the office later than usual. Before driving home, she sat alone inside her car with both hands resting on the steering wheel, replaying the same message in her mind. She disliked the person she seemed to be becoming. She had built both her company and her marriage on trust, not suspicion. Secretly checking someone's phone or following another person's movements felt completely opposite to everything she believed about relationships. Even so, doing nothing no longer felt right either. After several minutes, she reached a quiet compromise with herself. She wouldn't accuse anyone. She wouldn't search through private conversations or confront either of them without evidence. But she would stop assuming every explanation was automatically true. If there really was nothing to hide, the truth would eventually prove itself. If there was something she didn't know, she wanted to discover it through facts rather than imagination. Natalia started the engine and drove home with that single decision settled in her mind. For the first time in years, she wasn't planning her next business move. She was preparing to quietly observe the two people she had trusted more than anyone else. Natalia didn't change her behavior after making that decision. She greeted Terry the same way each morning, thanked her assistant whenever schedules were adjusted, and continued working as if nothing had happened. The difference existed only inside her own mind. Instead of accepting every explanation automatically, she began paying attention to details she had ignored for years. She noticed how often her assistant already knew where Terry would be before she asked. She noticed how naturally he contacted her assistant whenever a schedule changed instead of calling Natalia directly. None of those moments appeared suspicious on their own. In fact, every one of them could still be explained by work. Even so, Natalia stopped dismissing them the instant they happened. She simply remembered them. At the end of each day, she found herself mentally replaying small conversations and ordinary events that would have disappeared from memory only a week earlier. Most of the time, she still concluded there was nothing unusual. Yet the habit of observing had quietly replaced the habit of assuming. 3 days later, Natalia finished an investor meeting nearly an hour earlier than planned. Her next appointment had also been postponed, leaving an unexpected gap in the middle of the afternoon. Rather than returning directly to the office, she decided to stop by one of the company's flagship stores to review the latest display for the upcoming collection. While walking through the store, she called her assistant to let her know she would arrive back at headquarters later than expected. The call wasn't answered. That almost never happened. Her assistant usually picked up within seconds unless she was already in another meeting. Natalia ended the call without thinking much about it. Less than 2 minutes later, her assistant returned the call and apologized, explaining that she had stepped away from her desk to speak with a supplier. The explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. It should have ended there. Yet when Natalia returned to the office later that afternoon, she happened to pass the purchasing department. Marcus mentioned that the supplier meeting had been postponed until the following morning because the representative's flight had been delayed. The comment wasn't directed at Natalia. It was simply part of another conversation she happened to overhear while walking past. She kept walking without asking a single question. The manager had no idea his casual remark had quietly created the first fact Natalia couldn't immediately explain. Natalia didn't mention what she had overheard from the purchasing manager. She thanked him, walked back to her office, and finished the rest of the afternoon as though nothing had happened. One incorrect explanation wasn't enough to make her question someone she had trusted for years. People misunderstood schedules all the time, and there was no reason to turn a small inconsistency into something larger. A week later, another unexpected moment arrived. Natalia was on her way to meet a potential investor when she realized she had forgotten a folder containing several contract drafts. Instead of asking someone to bring it later, she turned the car around and drove back to headquarters. Most senior managers were attending a quarterly operations meeting, leaving the executive floor unusually quiet. As Natalia walked past her assistant's desk, she noticed the chair was empty. She assumed she had stepped into another department and continued toward her office. Before reaching the door, the elevator opened behind her. Her assistant walked out carrying 2 takeaway coffees. Almost at the same moment, Natalia's husband appeared from the stairwell at the opposite end of the hallway. The timing caught Natalia's attention more than anything else. Her assistant handed 1 cup to Natalia without hesitation, explaining she had gone downstairs for coffee before the afternoon meetings began. Terry smiled and said he had been nearby meeting a client and thought he would stop by to see whether Natalia had a few minutes free later that week. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Nothing either of them said sounded unusual. Every explanation fit naturally into the middle of a busy workday. Yet as Natalia watched them standing only a few feet apart, one detail quietly stayed with her. Neither of them looked surprised to see the other. There was no brief hesitation, no instinctive reaction people usually had when running into someone unexpectedly. They simply continued talking, as though the moment had unfolded exactly the way they expected. Natalia collected the folder she had returned for, thanked them both, and left for her meeting. During the drive across the city, she replayed those 2 minutes again and again. Separately, every explanation still made sense. Together, they no longer felt as effortless as they once had. Natalia refused to let suspicion control her decisions. She had spent too many years solving problems through evidence rather than assumptions to abandon that habit now. Instead of confronting anyone, she quietly began paying closer attention to the routines around her. She no longer ignored small details that once seemed insignificant. She noticed which evenings Terry stayed late at work, which business trips required her assistant to remain in the office after everyone else had gone home, and how often schedule changes happened on the same days. She didn't write anything down or search through anyone's belongings. She simply remembered. The more she observed, the more she realized something unexpected. It wasn't a dramatic mistake that caught her attention. It was consistency. The same patterns appeared again and again. When Natalia traveled, Terry and her assistant always seemed to have practical reasons to communicate. When an event required evening preparations, they somehow ended up coordinating the final details together. Every explanation sounded reasonable on its own, yet the number of coincidences kept growing. Natalia still hoped there was an innocent answer waiting somewhere. She wanted to prove herself wrong more than anything else. But for the first time in years, trust was no longer enough to satisfy her. She needed certainty. 2 evenings later, Natalia was reviewing presentation materials at home when her phone rang. It was one of the company's event coordinators calling about a charity gala scheduled for the following week. During the conversation, the coordinator mentioned needing to confirm the final guest list because one of the restaurants had mistakenly assigned 2 separate reservations under the company's corporate account. Natalia asked which restaurant they were referring to. The answer made her pause. It was the same Italian restaurant that had appeared in Terry's message. After ending the call, she opened the reservation confirmation that had been forwarded to her email because the booking had been made through the company's corporate account. Most of the reservations matched the charity gala schedule exactly. One booking, however, stood out. It wasn't connected to the event at all. It had been made for 2 people on a Thursday evening several weeks earlier, then canceled only a few hours before the reservation time. Natalia searched her calendar for that date. She had been in Chicago meeting with the national retail chain. Terry had told her he was having dinner with a client that night. Chaya had stayed late at the office preparing documents for the following morning. Natalia closed the email and leaned back in her chair. She finally had something more than a feeling. It still wasn't proof, but for the first time, the facts refused to match the explanations she had been given. Natalia didn't sleep well that night. The reservation stayed in her mind long after she turned off the bedroom light. She considered calling the restaurant, then decided against it. If she was wrong, every step driven by suspicion would become something she regretted. If she was right, rushing forward without thinking would only warn the people she was trying to understand. The following morning, she arrived at the office earlier than usual. Instead of going directly to her office, she walked through each department as she normally did, greeting employees and checking the progress of the upcoming collection. Nothing about the company had changed. Designers were reviewing sketches. Buyers were comparing fabric samples. Chaya was already at her desk, organizing documents for the first meeting of the day. She smiled exactly as she always had and handed Natalia the morning schedule. Natalia accepted it without hesitation. Looking at Chaya, nothing suggested she had lied about anything. The morning continued as planned until just before lunch, when Chaya stepped into the office and explained that she needed to leave for about an hour to meet a printing company preparing materials for the upcoming charity gala. The request sounded completely routine. Natalia approved it without asking another question. About 20 minutes later, Natalia called the printing company herself to discuss a few changes she wanted made to the event brochures. The manager apologized before explaining that the meeting with Natalia's company had already been postponed until the following afternoon because no one had arrived that morning. Natalia thanked him politely, ended the call, and slowly placed the phone back on her desk. This time, there was no delayed flight, no scheduling mistake, no misunderstanding. Someone had lied to her. She remained seated in silence for several moments before opening her calendar. Then, for the first time since all of this had begun, she canceled every meeting scheduled for the rest of the afternoon, picked up her car keys, and walked out of the office alone. Natalia closed the document in front of her and looked through the glass wall of her office toward the empty desk outside. She didn't call her assistant. She didn't contact Terry. She didn't ask anyone where either of them had gone. Years of negotiating business deals had taught her one lesson she never forgot. Facts were always more valuable than explanations. Quietly, she opened her calendar and canceled the remaining meetings for the afternoon, telling the receptionist only that something urgent had come up. A few minutes later, she left the building through the underground parking garage instead of the main entrance. The route out avoided the lobby and the security desk where employees usually greeted her. Once inside her car, she sat without starting the engine. She knew only one thing for certain. If her assistant hadn't gone to the printing company, then she had gone somewhere else. Natalia started the car and drove toward the Italian restaurant that had appeared in the reservation email. It wasn't because she believed they would be there. It was because every clue she had uncovered during the past several weeks seemed to point back to the same place. When she arrived, the lunch crowd had already begun filling the dining room. Natalia remained inside the car across the street, watching people enter and leave through the front entrance. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Just as she began wondering whether she had made a mistake, a familiar black sedan slowly pulled into the restaurant's parking lot. It belonged to Terry. Less than a minute later, another car stopped 2 spaces away. Chaya stepped out, looked around briefly, and walked toward the entrance. Terry was already waiting by the door. Neither of them noticed the woman sitting silently across the street. Natalia didn't move. She remained in the driver's seat with both hands resting on the steering wheel as she watched the two of them through the restaurant's front windows. Neither of them looked like people attending an unexpected business meeting. There were no folders, no laptops, and no signs of work waiting to be discussed. They chose a table near the back of the restaurant, away from the entrance and the larger groups having lunch. A waiter greeted them like familiar customers before leading them directly to the table. That small detail caught Natalia's attention immediately. They hadn't stopped there by chance. They had been there before. She watched Terry pull out a chair before the assistant sat down. It was the kind of gesture he rarely made anymore, not because he had become inconsiderate, but because years of marriage had turned many thoughtful habits into ordinary routines. As lunch continued, neither of them appeared tense or cautious. They smiled easily, talked without looking at the time, and occasionally laughed together. At one point, her assistant reached across the table to brush something away from the sleeve of his jacket. The movement lasted only a second, yet it carried a familiarity that no professional relationship could explain. Natalia lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back toward the restaurant. She wasn't angry. Not yet. The emotion she felt was stranger than anger. It was the quiet realization that everything she had believed about her life was beginning to separate from reality. She took out her phone and raised it just enough to capture several photographs through the front window. Then she placed the phone back on the passenger seat without looking at the images. She already knew what they contained. Natalia remained parked across the street until the lunch ended. She watched them leave the restaurant together before separating in the parking lot and driving away in different directions. Anyone arriving at that exact moment would have assumed they were simply two professionals finishing a business lunch. Only Natalia knew there had never been a meeting with the printing company that afternoon. She waited another 5 minutes before starting her own car. She didn't follow either of them. She didn't call anyone. She didn't return to the office immediately. Instead, she drove aimlessly through the city, allowing the silence inside the car to replace the noise inside her mind. The photographs on her phone were no longer just suspicions or unanswered questions. They were facts. Even so, Natalia understood they still weren't enough. A lunch together could always be explained away. She had built her career on evidence strong enough to withstand every challenge. She refused to destroy her marriage or her company based on something that could still be denied. By the time she returned to the office later that afternoon, her expression looked exactly as calm as it had that morning. Her assistant had already returned and apologized once again for the delayed meeting with the printing company. Natalia accepted the explanation with the same polite smile she always wore. She asked a few routine questions about the charity gala, signed several documents, and ended the conversation without revealing a single thought. For the first time since all of this began, Natalia knew exactly what she needed next. She didn't need another explanation. She needed undeniable proof. Natalia spent the next several days behaving exactly as she always had. She arrived at the office on time, approved new designs, attended investor meetings, and thanked Chaya for keeping an increasingly complicated schedule under control. At home, she shared dinner with Terry whenever both of them happened to be free. Nothing about her routine suggested she had seen anything at the restaurant. That decision wasn't made to deceive them. It was made to protect herself. The moment either of them realized she was suspicious, they would begin deleting messages, changing routines, and explaining away every inconsistency before she had a chance to understand the full truth. Natalia had negotiated enough business contracts to know one simple principle. The first person to reveal what they knew usually surrendered their greatest advantage. Instead of asking questions, she met with Violet, the company's legal counsel, after business hours. The meeting took place at a small law office several blocks away from headquarters, where nobody connected to the company would think to look for her. She explained only one thing. She wanted to understand how to protect both the business and its employees if someone close to her had violated the trust placed in them. She never mentioned names. She never described what she had seen. She listened carefully as Violet outlined the legal steps required before making any decision involving company assets, executive responsibilities, or a marriage. Natalia left with a folder of notes rather than a plan. She still hoped she would never need any of it. But for the first time since building the company, she began preparing for a future that no longer included the two people she had trusted most. After meeting with Violet, Natalia stopped thinking only as a wife. She began thinking as the founder of a company responsible for hundreds of employees. Every decision from that point forward had to protect the business first. During the following week, she quietly reviewed the company's internal authority structure. She discovered just how much access she had gradually given away over the years. Chaya controlled meeting schedules, handled confidential correspondence, coordinated communication with major investors, and had access to several internal systems that had once required Natalia's approval. None of those decisions had been careless. They had been made during years of growth when delegation became necessary. Even so, Natalia now understood how difficult it would be to separate Chaya from the company without disrupting daily operations. Rather than acting immediately, she instructed the IT department to begin updating security procedures for all executives, explaining that the company had grown enough to require stronger internal controls. New password policies were introduced. Access permissions were reviewed department by department. Financial approvals that had previously required only one executive signature now required two. Nobody questioned the changes because they looked like the natural next step for a business preparing for another stage of expansion. Chaya helped implement many of those updates herself, never realizing they were slowly reducing the amount of control she held over the company. Even after everything she had seen, Natalia still wasn't eager to end her marriage. Part of her hoped she had misunderstood something, or that one of them would decide to tell the truth before she was forced to uncover it herself. Over the next several days, she created opportunities that hadn't existed for months. She invited Terry to dinner without checking their calendars first. She suggested taking a weekend away after the next product launch. She even left the office early one afternoon, hoping they could spend a quiet evening together at home. Each invitation was accepted with enthusiasm at first, only to be interrupted later by another unexpected commitment. A client needed to reschedule. An urgent meeting had appeared. A business dinner couldn't be avoided. Every explanation sounded reasonable, yet every cancellation left the same feeling behind. Natalia stopped arguing with the excuses because she had already stopped listening to the words. Instead, she paid attention to the choices. Whenever work competed with time together, work always seemed to win. For years, she had believed those choices reflected the demands of successful careers. Now she began wondering whether they reflected something else entirely. She never confronted him. She simply watched another opportunity disappear, knowing she had given both her marriage and the truth one more chance to reveal themselves. Natalia no longer needed to know whether something was happening. She needed evidence strong enough that no explanation could erase it. A few days later, another opportunity arrived on its own. The company was preparing for a private dinner with several international investors, and the executive team planned to leave headquarters together that evening. Shortly before everyone was scheduled to depart, one investor called to postpone the dinner until the following week because his flight had been delayed. The event was canceled immediately. Employees began leaving the office earlier than expected, while department managers returned home with unexpectedly free evenings. Natalia announced that she would remain for another hour to review several contracts before leaving. About 20 minutes later, she walked past her assistant's desk and noticed it was empty. Assuming she had gone to inform another department about the canceled dinner, Natalia continued toward the conference rooms. She found no one there. She checked the executive lounge. It was empty as well. On her way back, she happened to pass the underground parking garage. From a distance, she saw her assistant getting into a car that didn't belong to the company. Seconds later, Terry stepped into the driver's seat. There was no hesitation between them, no discussion about where to go. The car pulled away as though they had followed the same routine many times before. Natalia remained where she was until the taillights disappeared beyond the garage exit. Then she quietly returned upstairs, collected her handbag, and left the building in her own car several minutes later. Natalia followed them from a distance, leaving enough space that neither of them would notice the same vehicle behind them. The drive ended at a quiet apartment complex on the opposite side of the city, far from the neighborhoods where either of them lived or worked. She watched as Terry parked inside the visitor lot. Her assistant stepped out first. They entered the building together without looking around, disappearing through the front entrance as though they had done it many times before. Natalia remained inside her car for almost half an hour. No clients arrived, no coworkers appeared, no business meeting took place. Only silence surrounded the building. At that moment, every unanswered question from the past several weeks settled into place. The message on the phone, the restaurant reservation, the false meeting with the printing company, the lunches, the carefully timed excuses. None of them stood alone anymore. They formed a single story, and Natalia was finally looking at it without hope changing what she saw. She reached for her phone, opened the camera, and photographed the building, the parking space, and Terry's car before placing the phone back beside her. When she finally drove away, she didn't cry. She didn't call either of them. She didn't even feel the urge to confront anyone. The woman who left that parking lot wasn't searching for the truth anymore. She had already found it. The only question left was how she intended to end the story. The following Monday, Natalia arrived at headquarters exactly on time. Nothing about her appearance suggested the previous week had changed her life. She greeted employees with her usual smile, attended the executive meeting, approved the next production schedule, and congratulated the design department on finishing the autumn collection ahead of schedule. By early afternoon, she asked Violet and Monica, the company's human resources director, to join her in a private conference room. For nearly 2 hours, they reviewed company policies, employment agreements, confidentiality clauses, and executive authority. Every step had to follow company procedures. Natalia refused to make a single emotional decision that could later be challenged in court or damage the business she had spent years building. Once the meeting ended, she instructed the IT department to deactivate Chaya's system access at exactly 5 o'clock that afternoon. Human Resources prepared a termination package based on a serious violation of company ethics and confidentiality obligations. At the same time, Violet finalized the divorce documents that had been quietly drafted during the previous week. Everything would happen on the same day. Neither Terry nor Chaya would have time to move company files, contact investors, or create confusion inside the organization. Natalia wasn't trying to punish them. She was protecting everything hundreds of employees had worked to build alongside her. At exactly 5 o'clock, Natalia asked Chaya to come into the executive conference room before leaving for the day. A few minutes later, Terry arrived as well after receiving a message from Natalia asking if he could stop by the office. Both entered expecting an ordinary conversation. Instead, they found Natalia seated at one end of the conference table beside Violet and Monica. 2 sealed envelopes rested neatly in front of her. The room remained silent for several seconds before Natalia slid the first envelope across the table toward Chaya. Inside was a formal notice ending her employment with the company, effective immediately. The second envelope was placed in front of Terry. It contained divorce papers already prepared for filing. Neither of them spoke. Natalia reached into her briefcase, placed several printed photographs on the table, and then laid down copies of the restaurant reservation, the canceled printing company appointment, and a timeline matching each false explanation she had been given over the previous weeks. She never raised her voice. She never accused either of them of anything that couldn't be supported by evidence. Every document spoke for itself. The silence inside the room lasted far longer than any argument could have. Only then did Terry and Chaya understand that Natalia hadn't uncovered part of the truth. She had uncovered all of it. For several seconds, neither of them touched the documents lying in front of them. Terry stared at the photographs as though seeing them for the first time. Chaya lowered her eyes, unable to look anywhere except the conference table. The silence finally broke when Terry insisted everything could be explained. He admitted that what had started as ordinary conversations had slowly crossed a line neither of them had intended to cross. Chaya quietly agreed, saying they had never planned to betray Natalia, but each time they wanted to end the relationship, they found another excuse to continue. Terry apologized repeatedly, admitting he had taken for granted the life he and Natalia had built together. Chaya apologized as well, saying she had repaid years of trust with one decision she could never undo. Natalia listened without interrupting. She had spent years negotiating with suppliers, investors, and corporate executives. She understood how easily people searched for gentler words once the truth could no longer be denied. She wasn't interested in hearing when the affair had started or who had made the first move. None of those answers would change what they had chosen to do. When they finally stopped speaking, Natalia calmly explained that her decision had already been made before either of them entered the room. The company would move forward without Chaya. Her life would move forward without Terry. Those decisions weren't driven by anger. They were simply the consequence of trust that could never be rebuilt. The meeting ended less than 30 minutes after it began. Human Resources escorted the former executive assistant back to her office to collect a few personal belongings while her company access was permanently disabled. Her identification card, laptop, and office keys were returned before she left the building for the final time. Employees watched quietly as she walked through the lobby carrying a single cardboard box. Most had no idea what had happened, but they understood enough not to ask questions. Natalia's husband remained inside the conference room a little longer, hoping she might reconsider the divorce. He apologized repeatedly, promised to end the relationship immediately, and admitted he had taken for granted the life they had built together. Natalia listened without changing her expression. She reminded him that everything surrounding them, the company, the recognition, the home they shared, and the future they had planned, had been built on one foundation: trust. The moment that foundation disappeared, everything standing on it collapsed as well. She stood, wished him well, and walked out of the room without looking back. By the time the elevator doors closed behind her, both people she had trusted most had already become part of her past. The divorce was finalized several months later without the public battle many people expected. Natalia declined every request from reporters hoping to uncover the reason behind the separation. She never criticized her former husband in interviews, never mentioned her former executive assistant on social media, and never allowed the company to become the center of public gossip. The official announcement described the divorce as a private family matter, and Natalia intended to keep it that way. Friends encouraged her to fight for every possible dollar during the settlement, reminding her how much pain the betrayal had caused. Natalia considered the advice carefully before reaching a different conclusion. She accepted only what the law and the business agreements clearly established as hers. The remaining portion that would have been transferred through the settlement became something she no longer wanted attached to her future. After discussing the matter with her financial advisors, Natalia established a charitable foundation dedicated to supporting children growing up without stable families. Every year, a portion of the foundation's investment income would fund education, clothing, and long-term scholarship programs. She didn't create the foundation to prove she was a better person than anyone else. She created it because she refused to let betrayal decide what kind of person she would become. The money that once represented the end of a marriage would now become the beginning of opportunities for children she would probably never meet. Life gradually settled into a quieter rhythm. Natalia spent less time attending glamorous business events and more time inside the company she had built from the ground up. She visited stores without announcing her arrival, reviewed new collections with young designers, and continued searching for fabrics with the same curiosity she had carried since her college years. Employees noticed one small change outside her office. A rescued orange cat had quietly become part of the headquarters after Natalia found it wandering behind one of the company's warehouses on a rainy evening. Instead of taking it to a shelter, she brought it home, and before long it had claimed its favorite place near the living room window. Every evening, after another busy day, the cat climbed onto the sofa beside her as she watched the evening news or read through the next day's reports. The house felt different now. It was quieter than before, yet strangely more peaceful. Natalia no longer measured happiness by the image people admired in magazines or on social media. She measured it by the peace she felt when she closed the front door at night, knowing no one inside that home had given her a reason to question their loyalty. One evening, the cat jumped onto her lap and looked up at her with complete trust. Natalia smiled, gently scratched behind its ears, and said, "I have a feeling you'll stay loyal longer than my ex-husband ever did." The cat answered with a soft purr before curling into a comfortable ball. Natalia laughed for the first time in a long while, picked up the remote, and settled back into the sofa. Outside, the city continued rushing toward tomorrow. Inside, she had finally found the kind of peace no award had ever been able to give her. The charitable foundation gradually became one of the projects Natalia cared about most. Every year, instead of organizing lavish celebrations after another successful financial report, she spent time visiting community centers, children's homes, and scholarship programs supported by the foundation. She rarely invited reporters to those visits and never turned them into marketing campaigns for her company. Most people only learned about the foundation through its annual financial reports, where every donation and every scholarship was listed with complete transparency. The same discipline that had built her business now shaped her charitable work. Every dollar had to create real opportunities instead of temporary headlines. Over the years, hundreds of children received school supplies, winter clothing, college assistance, and mentoring programs because of the foundation she had established after the divorce. Whenever people praised her generosity, Natalia answered with the same simple belief. Success became meaningful only when it improved someone else's future. Awards eventually gathered dust. Headlines disappeared within days. But helping another person build a better life could continue long after every business achievement had been forgotten. Several years later, Natalia once again stood on a stage accepting recognition for her work. This time, the awards celebrated the impact her foundation had created rather than the growth of her company. As the audience applauded, she thanked her employees, business partners, and everyone who had supported the foundation from the very beginning. She spoke only briefly before returning to her seat, never mentioning the painful chapter that had quietly led her there. That story belonged to the past. Later that evening, she arrived home, changed into comfortable clothes, and settled onto the living room sofa. The orange cat immediately climbed into her lap, circled twice, and curled up against her. Natalia smiled as she gently stroked its back while the evening news played softly in the background. Looking around the quiet house, she realized she no longer missed the life she thought she had lost. She had built something stronger than success, stronger than public admiration, and stronger than the marriage that had once defined her future. She had built a life that no longer depended on someone else's loyalty to remain whole. She looked down at the cat, smiled again, and said, "I still think you're more loyal than my ex-husband." The cat answered with another quiet purr, completely unaware that it had become part of the happiest ending Natalia never expected to find.